Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to be discussing building your own philosophy. But first I wanted to discuss talking about the actual book itself. I forgot to mention the actual plot of the story, so basically we're going to go over that first before we can go over actually how to build a plot. So Musashi kind of starts off as a character who gets involved in a battle early on, but quickly realizes that he is not as powerful as he thought he was. Ends up being on the losing end of a big fight. And when he wakes up, him and his buddy go and hide out in a woman's house. Come to find out that this woman was connected to a local bandit group that would collect the armor of dead soldiers to repurpose and then sell them. Musashi convinces his friend, hey, we need to go. The friend's like, okay. But then the next day, the woman, her daughter, and Musashi's friends disappear. Come to find out that the friend left in the middle of the night with the woman and the girl. So Musashi has to end up going home and telling his friend's mother. His friend's mother doesn't take it very well and blames Musashi for the whole situation and attacks him. Musashi defends himself and because of the situation, has to go on the run. Musashi does a really good job of making sure that he doesn't get caught, but then there's a Zen master that comes in and they capture him. They capture Musashi. So as punishment, the goal is that he's going to spend 3 years just in a cell reading. And that's a opportunity for Musashi to reinvent himself. Initially goes by the name of Takazo. So when he comes back out, they rename him Musashi. There's actually two different interpretations of somebody's name when it's written in the Japanese language. You have the Japanese and then I believe it's the Chinese version. And Musashi is the alternate version of Takazo. So Musashi goes on a long trip to find out what it means to be human. Basically, the idea is how to be the best version of himself. So the mode that he uses is the way of the sword because Musashi has a concrete idea of what that looks like. He's able to have a goal set, and that is the sole focus of him in this book after he leaves the Zen master. Now, early in the story, the friend had a fiance. She was a purportedly very beautiful woman, and when Musashi came back, told her that his friend wasn't coming back, she ended up falling for Musashi. And actually was involved with the capture of him and essentially fell in love with him. After that, we don't see her for a while as we're following Musashi through his trials and tribulations, his journey as it were. Later on, we find that she's actually looking for him, trying to reconnect with him because she has fallen in love with him. At a certain point, Musashi picks up a child that he begins to train as his pupil. And eventually what ends up happening is that there's a lot of ships crossing in the night type of situations. They end up meeting towards the end of the book where Musashi goes and fights this extremely talented, naturally talented swordsman who is a really cruel guy who's not above just killing anybody just because he feels like it. And because he's so good, nobody's willing to stand up to him. But as Musashi has been figuring out how to actually fight, and everything that he's gone through has led him up to this point, he takes on this guy more for doing it for himself rather than to put a stop to this guy. It's actually one of the most famous battles, one of the most famous duels that Musashi is known for. So that's pretty much the basic plot of the story. Obviously, a couple minutes worth of discussing it doesn't really sum up completely everything that goes on. So also, what happens with the friend is that he gets put up by the woman who has a tea shop, and she essentially controls everything. The friend has absolutely nothing to do, and it's very emasculating for him, and he becomes an alcoholic because of it. So he ends up hearing about Musashi or meeting Musashi and figures he needs to follow the same path, and so he does the same thing. And he has his own story arc, and the friend's mom is on the lookout for the friend, and she goes on a journey with a son of hers. So it's pretty complicated. A lot of characters are crossing each other over the course of the 900 pages. Overall, I would say that if you are interested in historical fiction, it is light on the romance. There's not a lot of romance at all, which is not surprising given how romance is typically done in Japan. It's not necessarily a will they, won't they, as you would see in Western media, but rather it's a will they ever get together, like actually get together, not like a off and on where you saw for like Friends. When it actually comes to building a philosophy, this is something that you kind of want to think a little bit ahead of time. Now, if you're just writing as a way of escape, as a hobby, that's perfectly fine. In fact, all of these ways are perfectly valid. I would never say that you should have one type of philosophy versus another. But it is important to actually have some forethought in what you want to do going forward. So, what type of stories do you want to write? Are we talking about stories that have very specific genres that you're part of? Romance, action, fantasy, sci-fi. These are all elements that can have an impact. And very often stories have multiple subgenres in each story themselves. How often do we have epic fantasies that have romance subplots? Now, you will always have a predominant genre that is for your story. The reason is because each genre not just has certain elements in the story, but also certain structural aspects of that story that fits with each genre. So if you have a epic fantasy where the epic fantasy is the primary driving force, that's going to have a different feel than, say, a romance. A romance is going to have a lot less world building as opposed a epic fantasy. Now, if you take certain elements and you try to mix them together, you're going to have a unique story, first off. But at the same time, it's going to be hard for publishers to categorize it because there are those that want to read epic fantasy and then there's those who want to read romance. So having clear-cut goals of the type of stories you want to write is going to play a part into it. Also, something else you want to take in mind. Are you writing for money? Are you writing for impact? When you're writing for money, you're going to be choosing specific story plot lines based on where the market is. If you're looking just for impact, you're going to create a world that you want to have an impact on your readers. Are you looking to have a book that sticks with a reader? Obviously, that is the ultimate goal of every writer, to have an impactful because of all the stuff that goes into it. But the problem is that not in every case are you going to have a book that's very impactful that's going to be as popular. So, for example, certain books are very read the story and then put it aside. It was a very popular book. It's a very flash in the pan type of book, whereas books that have a lot more impact tend to resonate with more people and tend to last longer in the social consciousness. Is this going to be a side hustle? Is this a sole employment? Somebody who is looking to spend just a couple hours a day working on this isn't going to necessarily be as focused if they have other stuff going on in their life. Is this supposed to be a sole employment thing? Anybody who's spent any time in the writing sphere knows that it's very hard to get your writing to be your sole means of income. And this is not just the writing, but are you doing a mix where you offer courses or videos or critique classes or whatever, or are you just writing? Very rarely are writers able to make a living off their writing. Just their book sales is actually quite rare. I've heard people compare it to Major League Sports. There's actually more Major League sports players than there are writers who are able to live off of their writing. Now, again, these are things that are just thoughts you should be thinking about and what you want for your future. Is this a hobby or a career? Going back to whether it's going to be a sole employment or is this something that you're just going to do part-time? If this is a hobby, this is not something that you're going to be looking to be spending a lot of money in. But just like every other hobby, golf, sports, cars, whatever, there's going to be resources allocated for it, but the purpose of it is not necessarily to have a high return on investment, but rather something that you enjoy doing. Again, both are perfectly valid, and you should do what makes you happy when it comes to your writing. If you aren't doing something that makes you happy in your writing, then you should question whether or not you're actually doing the writing properly, if at all. What are your long-term versus short-term goals? Are you looking to put out 5, 6, 7 books? Are you looking to do short stories that are not going to be as time consuming? What's the next few weeks going to look like? What's the next couple years going to look like? There are people that say you should have a quarterly business goals and you should be meeting those. Those are valid ways of thinking about it. What do you want to see happen? If you don't have a plan of what the future is going to look like, there's very little chance that those things are actually going to come about. What does success look like? Some people equate financial gain as successful, or being popular, or being published. That's what success looks like, but that's not always the case. The best writers aren't necessarily the ones that get picked up by publishers. Quite often, you'll have published books that you'll take a look at and you're like, why? This doesn't make sense. This isn't a well-written book. It's quite often that you hear very specific, very popular writers are criticized as not being very good writers on a line level breakdown. But because they have an understanding of the business of publishing, they are able to create worlds, they are able to create business connections that help them sell their books to a wider range. There are tips and tricks that you can learn that can help you write these books that are going to make them easily accessible to publishers. Things like query letters and blurbs and summaries and stuff like that. Things that you can learn how to work in the business of publishing. There was a quote by Larry the Cable Guy, a redneck comedian, who said that he was told by Jeff Foxworthy, another redneck comedian. And Jeff Foxworthy said, it's not the best people that succeed in the comedy industry, but rather those that know the business well. Success, in a lot of ways, has less to do with how you produce art, or rather how you are as an artist, but rather how you are as a business person. How does your acumen look like when it comes to how they are presented, or how you talk to people, or the connections that you make? Very often, writers who are very creative sometimes lack that business acumen. They see like, hey, I have this really good idea, I have these really good plot points, but because they are, and sometimes this is the case, they are unwilling to change their method of trying to get into the publishing industry. They are not picked up by agents or publishers or editors or anything like that. So one of the ways that you can circumvent that nowadays with technology is you can self-publish. The resources for self-publishing are numerous. I mean, it's far easier to self-publish nowadays with anything that you put out. Personally, I don't want to self-publish because there is a element of acceptance if you are traditionally published. With the bar being so high, it's a way for me seeing that I have achieved something that is harder. And that's how I view things. So you really need to pay attention and figure out, what do you think success looks for your story? Are you going to self-publish? Again, perfectly valid. But there are pros and cons to self-publishing. Self-publishing doesn't require the same level of scrutiny from an editor or agent. Not that there isn't publishing groups that are essentially indie publishers that just stick your book on like a list somewhere and do nothing with it. But the groups that are willing to do the most work for it are going to have a higher standard of what they expect from your story. And 90% of that is, are you following the rules that they are setting out beforehand? Does your query letter look good? Does your blurb look good? Is your sentence level good? They are things that the publishing industry has set as a standard for entry. And a lot of writers kind of chafe at the idea of, well, they are publishers, they don't have a right to say how I am telling my story. But they do, because that old adage, Whoever has the gold makes the rules. So, as writers, we need to be aware that just because we are able to tell a cohesive story or that people like our story doesn't mean that they are going to be recognized as such by traditional publishers. Now we're going to get into the actual content of your book. What are the trade-offs for your characters? Are they going to be going through different things? The choices that they make have consequences. What are those consequences? So often you see stories where you're given a situation and the choices that they make don't have consequences. This is one of the downsides of having multiverse theory as part of your story. You're able to do A, but the consequences of A is that B happens. But in another multiverse, you don't have that consequence. So you're not able to create a cost of what they're doing. And readers need to feel like their actions have consequences. When your characters do things that don't make sense, that their actions don't have consequences, you're going to lose your readers. As an example, an anti-oppression revolution leads to instability, political and cultural. If you have a dictatorship, there's a level of stability. People understand what's going on. But once you overthrow that dictatorial regime, it creates instability because you have people vying for power. Nature abhors a vacuum. That's why if you overthrow a government, unless you replace it rapidly with a well-functioning government, if you have other aspects that you're able to lean on when it comes to how your culture is going to, or how your society is going to interact with each other, you are going to create fear and panic. And that, in a very complex society, leads to death and pain and suffering. What are the cost rewards of the 7-story archetypes? So often we think about, hey, what are the basic outlines for stories? But we also have to think of, what is the consequences? What are the results of, say, overcoming the monster? That old story, I believe it's Nietzsche, says, when you stare into the abyss stares into you. There is a blowback effect of becoming the person to overcome the monster. To overcome that dragon, you have to become somebody able to overcome that monster. What's the results of that? Rags to riches. There was a old movie called Little Lord Fauntleroy. They did one of those old videos and nobody liked it because it was literally a kid that was born poor and he just gets a lot of money. And because there was no cost to that, people didn't like it. As my dad said, it was so sweet it gave you tooth decay. That's not a story that has a long-term connection with the readers. The quest. Lord of the Rings is a quest story. But as I said earlier, sometimes genres kind of mix. The story archetypes, the quest for Lord of the Rings, it was not just a quest, but it was a voyage and return. Now, another voyage and return would be the Odyssey, Ulysses. These are stories about somebody going somewhere and coming back and how that journey affected them. The comedy, the things that we deal with on a daily basis that are funny. And there's different types of comedy. You have one that is dark comedy where, say, for instance, the movie Death of Stalin. You have a situation where things are comedic, but there's a dark undertone underneath. Tragedy. People going through really tough times. What a lot of tragedy is you have two conflicting truths. And how do you resolve that? Then you have a rebirth. Somebody who's gone through tough things and they're reinventing themselves and trying to overcome the person that they were previously. These are all things that you need to be thinking about when you're writing your story. My thinking is what do I want for the outcome of this story? And working my way backwards. How do I get to that point? How do I create a character that will get to that point? What's the backstory that person has to go through? So that's just something I wanted to share with you guys today. I really didn't have an idea about thinking of actual writing techniques because that's not really what we went over on Tuesday. So if you have any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, let me know. As always, I will be linking the resources I use in the description. So have a good day. Bye.
I am a poor wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger to which I go.